to prove the controlled demolition hypothesis here. I'm doing something that I think is easy. Well, it's easy to prove historically, and I think is more important than most people realize. I'm just saying that on the day of 9/11, it was articulated frequently and publicly that explosions may have brought down the buildings. This was later whisked down the memory hole. 10:28 a.m., CNN anchor Aaron Brown watches the North Tower come down live, shocked. And then he says whether there were second explosions, that is to say explosions other than the planes hitting them, that caused this to happen, we cannot tell you. End of quote. He then says he's got Rose Arce on the phone, the CNN producer who was outside watching the event. He says, "What do you got, Rose?" And she says, again, this is all direct quotations, "You saw the top of the building start to shake, and then the entire top of the building just blew up." Half an hour later, 10:57 a.m., Brown asked CNN correspondent Patty Davis what she witnessed when the South Tower came down. She explained she was 1,000 yards away from the South Tower when it came down and says, quote, "It was a massive explosion," end of quote. 10:46 a.m., Aaron Brown shows us a replay of the South Tower destruction and comments on it. I have to say, I feel sorry for the guy. Well, I don't anymore, but I did initially when I watched this, because I thought, what a weird position to be in, to be a television news anchor, where you've got a certain kind of objective reality going on the screen that you've got to give some kind of account of. But you've got everything from national myths to the pressure of the corporation that owns your TV station. You've got everything constraining you. And you're the guy who's you're the person that's supposed to mediate between these two. And this is a pretty raw example of how to mediate. He says, "It almost looks like one of those planned implosions." But of course there was nothing planned and it was not an implosion. Poor guy, what else could he say? If it was a planned implosion, the implications would be unthinkable. The mayor, Giuliani, is asked twice on CNN during the day whether explosions brought down the towers. To his credit, Aaron Brown asks at 12:30. He asked the mayor if there were explosions other than plane impacts that brought down the towers. The mayor says he doesn't think so, but he's not sure. 2:39 p.m. At a press conference, the mayor is asked again. This time he's got his briefing notes and he's a little more definite that, seems to be just after effects of the planes hitting. But I want you to listen to the question that the female reporter, who's not on screen so I can't see her, I don't know who she is, listen to the question that she asks him at 2:39 p.m. on 9/11. "Do you know anything about the cause of the explosions that brought the two buildings down? Was it caused by the planes or by something else?" This is the middle of the day on 9/11 on CNN. This is what people on the scene were asking. She doesn't ask if there were explosions. She says, of course there were explosions. She doesn't ask if they brought the buildings down. She says, of course they brought them down. They just want to know what caused them. This has been swept down the memory hole. But you see, I didn't watch TV, and I missed the construction of this story. I didn't hear these people. I didn't hear the eyewitnesses. I had to read about all the eyewitness stuff years later. And I didn't see how weak the whole thing was. So here's the message to the peace movement on this one. When it comes to the collapse or the destruction of these towers, there's no default position. You have to choose between the same two hypotheses. And you can't choose on the basis of a chain of faith. You have to choose on the basis of a chain of evidence. If I were to think of broad terms to characterize these two sets of hypotheses, I'd call one the government hypothesis and one the non-government or civil society hypothesis. When I call one a government hypothesis, I don't just mean the U.S. government, the Bush administration, FEMA, NIST, all supported it. I mean that officially, at least, almost every government in the world supports it. Of course, whether they actually all believe it is another matter. Well, most of them, with the possible exception of, Venezuela, possibly Cuba and Iran, but with almost no exceptions, governments in the world have signed on to the official narrative. It's a government hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis all along has been supported by non-governmental people and organizations, or as we nowadays tend to say, civil society organizations. And it seems to me ironic and sad that the peace movement, which is one of the oldest civil society organizations in the world, which even in its modern phase is about 200 years old, and which understands in general the need to oppose government and question government, especially, for God's sake, when it comes to war, and has developed its own intellectuals, its own newspapers and alternative media, has a foothold in the university, and all this stuff is somehow, for the most part, supporting the government hypothesis. Not good enough. And please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying the peace movement should say, because governments say it, it must be wrong, or because civil society supports this one, it must be right. No, it's not a question of trusting anybody, but it's a question of respecting civil society enough to read the bloody stuff that they write. Thank you. And finally, I said I made 3 mistakes. I'm on the 3rd one now. We're getting somewhere here. We won't be going too much longer. The 3rd one is, I was a university professor, supposed to be a smart university professor. When I was a kid, I thought university professors must all be geniuses. Secret, not true. But I was teaching peace studies, I was teaching about war, I had taught the Vietnam War to students, I had taught the Gulf of Tonkin incident to students. I knew about fraudulent trigger incidents. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was entirely fraudulent, but was used to trigger a war between the United States and much of Southeast Asia. A digression here, in ancient Rome, when war was decided upon, a priest was sent into the temple of Mars, the war god. He would shake the sacred spears and say, Mars vigila, meaning wake up, god of war, wake up. And off would go the Roman legions to devastate some place or other and add it to the empire. And it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that in August 1964, Lyndon Johnson came into Congress with his fraudulent Gulf of Tonkin incident and shook the sacred spears. He said, Mars vigila. And Congress stood up almost to a person and said, yes, wake up, God of war. The vote was 414-0 in the House of Representatives, 88-2 in the Senate. And the God of war woke up. And by the time he was finished with Southeast Asia, millions of people were wounded and dead, and whole ecosystems had been destroyed. That's what war does, and that's what a fraudulent trigger incident does, and I should have known. Not only does this lead to death of the enemy, of course, war, fraudulent trigger incidents lead to the restriction of civil rights at home. This is not a new insight. This is what war does. It doesn't just harm those attacked, it harms the host society. And I'm going to quote David Dodge here, who founded what is often said to be the oldest peace society in the modern peace movement in New York City, the New York Peace Society, which he founded in 1815. And he understood this principle. This is what he said: to inflame a mild republic with the spirit of war is putting all its liberties to the utmost hazard. I don't know what David Dodge would think of his mild republic today, which eats up half of the world's military expenditures. 190 states in the world, the United States spends half of the total military budget of the world. What happened to the mild republic? It was inflamed again and again and again and again, and the war system took hold and is very powerful, I'm afraid to say, in this society today. So, to get back to my rather fragile autobiographical thread, I should have been aware of my duty to study 9/11, to see if it was genuine, to teach my students about it. And I have done my best since then, especially in the last 2 years, to make